Hi everyone, it's Darlene. Welcome back for today's card. Today I've got a holiday thank you card for you. I'm using this penny black stamp called Le Fleur Rouge. It's got a picture on the back that I'm going to use as a guide. I'm also using these Simon Says Stamp large tags, this one in the upper left, and some distress markers. I'm going to start off by coloring my stamp with distress markers. I have Worn Lipstick and Festive Berries. I'm going to color all of my poinsettias with these two colors. First, I'm going to cover the whole flower with the Worn Lipstick. And again, I'm going to use my photo here as a guide, just because there's a lot of different pieces to it and it's easier to just look at the picture. So I'm going to color the whole thing Worn Lipstick, and then I'll take my Festive Berries and add some highlights. So I'm really just putting in some shadow in the center of the flower, and then I'll draw some lines kind of around each of the petals. Not too much. You know what's going to happen is once I spray this with water, it's going to kind of all run together. So what I'm really looking for is just a little bit of variation in color. So I'm going to go ahead and color all of these. I'll do the Worn Lipstick and then the Festive Berries each time. Now I'm not worried too much about my ink drying because I'm going to re-moisten it with some water. So I'm going to spray it in a little bit. So once I'm done with my flowers, I'm going to move on to the leaves and the stem. I'm using Forest Moss and Pine Needles. And I'm going to start with the Forest Moss, and I'm just going to color all of the pieces of the stamp that haven't been colored yet. So everything that's left, all of the leaves and the stems, are going to be colored all over with the Forest Moss. And the Pine Needles, I'm going to just highlight a little bit, like a line here and there on each of the leaves and a little bit on the stem. And I found that after I stamped it, there wasn't really a whole lot of variation with these two colors. But anyway, so I added it. And finally, I took the Forest Moss and added some color to the center of each of these flowers. Now it's time to spray this. I sprayed it with Perfect Pearls, which is just some Perfect Pearls powder mixed with water in a mini mister. I'm going to shake that up really well, and then I'm going to hold it up about, I'd say, a foot away is what I did. So I'm going to show you here. I'm about this far away from when I sprayed it, and I took it off camera just because I had more space. But you can see it's very well misted, but it's not pooling water. So it's not a lot of water, it's just enough to moisten the ink. So I'm going to stamp this on a piece of Ranger watercolor paper. I chose this paper because it's very bright white and I wanted nice contrast against these colors. So it's a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece that I'm going to trim later. I seem to get better blending results with the textured side of this paper, so I used that side. But the downside is that I didn't get as crisp of an image as I would have liked. So what I'm going to do is take my Aqua Painter. It's just a detailer water brush by Ranger. And I'm going to start in the flower area and just fill in all those white spots. And you can see the colors just fill right in when they're reactivated with water. I think the Strathmore watercolor paper does a much better job of blending, but again, I wanted that really crisp white color. And I figured while I was in here, I would drop a little bit more Festive Berries. So I would just take my marker and color my craft mat a little bit, and then I can pull that color up with my water brush. And I'm just going to drop it right there in the centers of the flowers just to add a little bit more shadowing in there. I'm going to do that on all of this. And it's already wet because I colored over them with the water, so it's just blending right in. Now clear off my water brush for the next color, and I'm going to start with the Forest Moss. And this was a little bit harder to blend. I think maybe the stamp wasn't as moist as it could have been, maybe. I'm not sure, but I got really dark colors here. So what I ended up doing when I wasn't having a lot of success with blending these colors together, I grabbed my Forest Moss and put some on my craft mat. So I'm going to color with my marker here, and then I'll pull it up with my Aqua Painter, and that will kind of darken up all of these leaves, but at least they'll get a nice consistent shading. So I'm going to go and do all that, and notice I also added a stem for that middle flower. Now when I drew that stem, I was using the Aqua brush, and so I got a very faint stem. So I went back in with my Forest Moss marker. I'm using the brush tip, and I'm just coloring that a little bit more. And the whole thing is pretty sketchy, so it doesn't have to be perfect. And now I'm just going to finish this stem up with my Aqua Painter. Now you could leave the image just as it is, and that's kind of what it was made to look like, but I wanted to go in and add more detail. So I took my Festive Berries marker, I'm using the fine tip, and I'm just going to draw some lines around the edges, not all the edges, but most of them, and I'm also going to draw some veins. And so when I go in with the marker, I'm creating kind of a darker edge and maybe even shading a little bit, and then just drawing the vein lines for each of these leaves. And I'm not very good at drawing freehand flowers, so I'm just sort of trying to figure out where the flowers, or where the leaves, I guess these are sort of leaves slash petals, where they would be, where they would start, how they would overlap, how they would end. I don't think I did a very accurate job of this, but because it is kind of a sketchy image, I think it looked fun, and I really actually like the way it turned out with these lines in it. So anyway, you can add these lines in it, or you can just leave it for a really pretty watercolor look. Now I also added, you'll see here that I'm adding some more Festive Berries to the very center, just to add a little bit more shadow to where the petals meet the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and color all the rest of these the same exact way, and I'll speed it up and I'll be back in about a minute. I use the same technique on the leaves, except I'm using the forest moss, not the pine needles. So just drawing around the edges and then adding some of the leaf veins. And so anyway, I'll go through this and I'll be back in about a minute. Alright, so finally I took the brush tip of my forest moss and I added some dots just to accentuate that middle part of the flower and add a little bit of interest, because it kind of had gotten lost when I sprayed it. Okay, and that's it for the coloring. I'm going to trim my panel down 1/4 inch on each side. And then I'm going to take my Simon Says stamp tags. I'm going to use the squarish tag at the top. And this was a little nerve-wracking because I spent so much time coloring it. I was a little nervous about ruining it potentially by cutting this in the middle, but I went ahead and did it, and I like the way it turned out. I covered most of the flowers, so here it is popped out. And then I decided to add just a little detail along the edge. This is a silver marker, and I'm just going to hold it against the edge and very carefully draw a little bit of a line. It's pretty faint, so I'm not sure the recipient would see it, and you probably don't even see it in the photo, but I just like to add a little detail like this. And that will kind of outline my tag just a little bit. I have this silver thread that's very, very thin, and so I'm going to wrap it several times, just kind of back and forth. I'm going to cut a pretty large piece because at the time I thought I was going to be tying a bow, but you'll see what happens after I try that. Anyway, so once I've got it wrapped around a few times, I'm just going to take my scissor, I'll cut the edge, and then all those loops, I'll just cut those. So one on one side, and then I had a couple on the other side. So I'm just being careful because this string is a little wild. It's very shimmery and beautiful, but it's thin and it kind of goes in all directions. To get it through the hole, I just laid it across the hole, and then I took my paper piercer and I just kind of went down and then up, and that's how I pulled it through the hole, and it came out perfect. So You can see how it's kind of going all over the place here, so it's hard to control. So I went ahead and grabbed my glue dots, and I'm going to take a glue dot and I'll roll it in between my fingers to get it into a little ball, and then I'm going to place it right there at the top of my tag, and that way it'll hold my knot into place, because it's almost impossible to hold all of these pieces into place when you're trying to tie a bow or a knot. So I'm going to tie it once around, and you'll see that once I pull the ends and press down in the middle on top of that glue dot, all of the pieces will stay firmly in place. And this is great for any kind of ribbon or twine. I've used this trick quite a bit. So here I am doing the bow, and I think it looks really pretty. And I kind of like all the strings going everywhere, but the problem is that I don't think that the bow was tight enough, and I thought it might come undone in the mail or while somebody was reading it, and I didn't want that to happen. So I just decided to go with a knot. And because I have that glue dot there, you can kind of pull the ends in any direction that you want and kind of make sure that they're nice and pretty laid out on the card. So I'm just trimming up the ends, and that'll be it for the string. I got my sentiment from this Altenew set called Magnolias for Her. It was just the perfect size, and I'm going to stamp it with some Versamark ink on vellum. I always use vellum for my sentiment when I'm not sure where to put it or I don't want to cover anything up with it. So I'm going to put some black embossing powder on here. This is Ranger Superfine, and I've already done the top edge by using the top of my cardstock, and so all I need to do is trim the bottom. And then I'll center it on my tag and just very carefully fold it toward the back on each side, just trying to keep it as close to the cardstock as possible. And then I'm just going to grab a tape runner, just one of my small tape runners that I have that I get at a local craft store when my ATG gun is a little too big. And then I'll just carefully wrap that around the back and stick it on the back. And I didn't think I needed anything to adhere it to the front. And then it's time to put it all together. So I'm going to use a Hero Arts black note card. I love these note cards because they're white on the inside, so you don't have to worry about adding another piece of cardstock for your message. So I'm just going to put some ATG tape runner along the back here of my background. And I have that mat along all the edges. And then I'm going to take my tag and put some Scotch foam tape, and then it'll pop up a little bit, and I have that silver edge just to make it pop a little bit more. And that is the card for today. So kind of a fun, different take on this stamp. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.